it's still in a state of civil war. Uh, the Kurds, the Shiites, the Sunnis have not yet reached firm balance and understanding about what is going to be the case. Plus, there are other outside forces that are definitely impinging on Iraq. One is Iran, and the other is Turkey. I mean, Turkey has an interest in the status of the Kurds. It opposes an autonomous Kurdistan because of its own Kurdish problems. It's interested in Iraqi oil in the north. So Iraq is a country that has always been pulled by regional powers as well as by global powers, and they manipulate what goes on inside the country. So I think it's very early to say that it's been successful. Certainly those people who criticize the Bush administration as in a hopeless quagmire were wrong, but we can't go from that to the idea that this is going to go smoothly or not break out another really violent outburst. Well, Maliki, of course, is delighted at the U.S. drawdown. He represents the Shiites as well as the country. And the Shiites hold a lot of the cards, both because they're backed by Iran, some of them are backed by Iran, and because they're just a larger group. The Kurds and the Sunnis are much more uneasy about the American withdrawal. The Americans have come to be seen as the guarantors of their security. And the question that everyone is asking is, as the United States withdraws, uh, will that security continue to be there? Will the Shiites respect the Sunni and the Kurdish position? Will the Sunnis respect the Kurdish position? And so on. And so the real question that really is not going to be answered for another year because the U.S. withdrawal is slow. The real question as we come toward the end of the U.S. drawdown is how secure do the various Sunni factions and Kurdish factions feel? Do they trust the national army? Will the national army and security forces be a truly national one or a balkanized one divided by groups? There are many, many questions to be answered before then. But Iraq has a history of chaos versus dictatorship, and it's oscillated between the two, only occasionally stopping at stable, autonomous national integrity. So I can't say that I'm optimistic about what's going to happen. I think the likelihood is a great deal of pain yet. Well, I think the real problem is that many Iraqis don't want to see the U.S. go. That having entered, many of the groups feel very vulnerable to the current government and see the U.S. as the guarantor of their security. So I think the real crisis is going to occur as we draw down past the 50,000 point, that groups are going to be asking the United States to stay. Groups are going to feel very exposed without the United States. So I'm not sure the United States is going to be able to take the boots off the ground completely. That some residual force serving to guarantee the interests of some of the American clients in the country aren't going to have to be remain to protect them. Well, the greatest block to Iranian nuclear weapons are the Iranians. Uh, the development of enriched uranium is to nuclear weapons what gasoline is to a car. If you have gasoline, you can run a car, but doesn't mean you have one. To design nuclear weapons that are deliverable, you have to do two things. You have to miniaturize them so they can fit on rockets or on aircraft, and you have to ruggedize them. Launching a nuclear weapon is a very shaky experience. Vibrations, you go into vacuum, extremes of temperature, and so on. That's hard. It's pretty easy to have an explosion underground somewhere. It's very different to translate into a deliverable nuclear weapon. And the Iranians, while they have the capability, with some difficulty, of producing enriched uranium, lack many of the technologies that go into building a deliverable nuclear weapon and a missile that can do it. And one of the reasons that Iran has not been attacked by the United States and Israel is because both countries are aware of the limits of what the Iranians can do. That said, this is an area where a great deal of risk can't be taken. And therefore, since no one can be certain how good intelligence is about where they stand, there has to be, particularly in part of the Israelis, a very conservative stance on how far they're permitted to go. We have to remember, however, that in the case of Iran, strikes only on nuclear facilities are not going to be possible. Iran has a decent air defense system that will have to be attacked. But the most important thing to remember is if Iran is attacked, it will respond. And its most important response will be mining the Straits of Hormuz and the rest of the Persian Gulf. And if that happens, then the consequences to the world economy will be enormous. And so the real question is not whether or not anyone can bomb their nuclear facilities, but can the mining capability of the Iranian Navy be taken out first? So before any attacks are made on the nuclear facilities, which aren't going anywhere, any mine-laying ships will have to be taken out very early. So this is a much more complicated operation than happened in 1981 in Iraq. To do that, it'll be very visible, because it will be very visible that they have now missiles. You can't hide them. They're not going to be able to hide them easily. And it'll be very obvious that they're mounting warheads on them. At that point, I believe the United States will carry out airstrikes, and they'll carry out airstrikes in preference to having the Israeli carried out airstrikes. And the goal will be to destroy those facilities. The problem, of course, is that the Iranians have hardened the production facilities. So you may be able to take out the missiles, but taking out the production facilities will be much more difficult.
And what about sort of the geopolitical ramifications? I mean, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the dynamics of the entire Gulf region and Iran's role in it. What would the nuclear armed Iran do to that balance?
Iran already is the major power within the Persian Gulf. Absent the United States, the Iranians are in a position with their current military forces to impose a pax on the region, to dominate the region. The acquisition of nuclear weapons really doesn't add to that. What it adds to it is the ability to strike farther outside the region. The reason the Iranians want these weapons is regime survival. They saw what happened in the former Soviet Union. They've seen the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan. They want the Islamic Republic to survive. And they're aware that if they have nuclear weapons that can reach allies of the United States or even the United States itself, the United States will behave much more carefully in relationship. So rhetoric aside, and it's important to ignore rhetoric because everybody can do it, their goal is deterrence. But at the same time, we have to remember that without the United States, they are the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. No combination of forces, now that the Iraqi army has been destroyed, can possibly resist the Iranians. Well, Egypt is far away, and delivering a force to the Persian Gulf would be very difficult, and Egypt's military is not in good shape. But the entire point is that the Gulf states taken together can't begin to measure up to the Iranians. The only regional power that can affect the balance of power in the region is Turkey. Should Turkey choose to get involved, that would be more than a match for the Iranians. And the Iranians are very careful not to alienate the Turks. And the Turks are very careful not to get drawn too deeply into a struggle against Iran. But the native forces in the Persian Gulf are unable to block the Iranians. And that's really been the condition ever since 1979. Well, the Russians don't want to reset Russian relations. You have to remember that from the Russian point of view, the fall of the Soviet Union was what Putin called a geopolitical catastrophe. The vision that the United States has of the period 1990 to 2004 was this was a pretty good time in U.S.-Russia relations. That's not the Russian perception. So the Obama administration could not have delivered a worse message to the Russians than to say, let's go back to Boris Yeltsin. Let's go back to the early days of the Putin era. There's no reset to this because the entire Russian strategy is to never go back there again. The Obama administration essentially is following not only the Bush policy, but the Reagan policy. The Reagan policy was to play on the weakness of the Russian economy and to assume that if the Russian economy is weak, Russia can't present a threat. This is a deep misreading on the part of the Obama administration of Russia at this point, because Russia has never had a good economy. Under the Tsar, under Stalin, under Brezhnev, the Russian economy was always a cripple. and yet they were a major global power, fearsome and terrifying. And the reason is because in Russia, the economy is dominated by the only institution that efficiently works, the KGB, the NKVD, and so on. And they are able, therefore, through the use of force and terror, to transfer from the economy to the military economy any resources they want. And so you have an asymmetry in Russia, a weak economy and a very strong military, and that's exactly where Putin and Medvedev are going again. The Obama administration, following the thinking of Henry Kissinger, said, let's find an issue that we can all agree on. And they dusted off an old and tired issue of arms control, which really doesn't affect anything right now. Not because anybody takes it seriously, but let's get an agreement on something. The Russian view is that basically the Americans are treating the Russians with contempt by putting this on the table. There are issues that the Russians want to discuss, such as American respect for Russian preeminence in the former Soviet Union, American presence in Poland. These are things they want to discuss. And the Russians see arms control as an American attempt to divert them from the real issues. In trying to block Russian influence in Ukraine, the first thing we have to ask is, can we do it? And very frankly, in the Ukraine and in the Caucasus, Russia is the preeminent power. Globally, it isn't. But regionally, within these areas, they have far more influence than the United States. Therefore, in continuing to push the position that Russia should not be preeminent in these countries, it's a very interesting position. It's not a very practical one. The only thing that it does is convince the Russians that the United States continue to intend not only to dismember the Soviet Union, but to dismember the Russian Federation, and that they want assets in these countries to help them in this. So it ratchets up the crisis. Western Europe could, of course, play a role if it wasn't Western Europe. Western Europe has two problems. Firstly, it has no appetite for conflict or near conflict. But they have another problem. Russia provides a huge percentage of German natural gas. The Russians have also indicated and have cut off Russian natural gas that they're prepared to use this for political ends. Germany can't survive very well without that Russian natural gas, and therefore German room for maneuver is severely limited. If the Germans can't participate, what the French do or the Italians do really doesn't matter. This is about Germany. And the Russians have been very careful to draw the Germans into a relationship of dependency. So, for example, during the General Motors crisis, when Opel, a division of General Motors, was on the block, it was a Canadian company that came in to buy Opel, but it was Russian money that financed it. And there was a strategic reason for that. I don't see a stalemate because, in fact, American support for Georgia and Ukraine are primarily rhetorical. There is no substance. Because of the window of opportunity that's been opened by the imbalance of U.S. forces, their commitment to Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. during the Russian invasion of Georgia had no forces that it could effectively deploy that was meaningful. So what you have is a situation in which, one, there are no American forces available for deployment. Two, there are no allies that want to go with us. Three, American economic assistance to Ukraine and Georgia has been and must be minimal because they really can't metabolize it. And therefore, four, the presence of this enormous, economically weak but powerful presence of Russia is always a driving reality. So the real question is, how long does American rhetoric hold the Russians back, or does it draw them in?